We just heard some great analysis in the past, well, every session so far, and now Doug and I will take us back a little bit and do a little more history than current affairs. But hopefully we can make this, our presentations relevant to today's discussions and the ideas we've heard expressed in the other sessions. Well, first of all, most folks are aware that Napoleon conducted an invasion of Russia in 1812, in which he lost 500,000 men. Less familiar folks are with his invasion of Spain and Portugal beginning in 1807. What I'm going to do today is try and break down those operations for you and provide some analysis and try to use Napoleon's experience, really the French experience, because Napoleon was only in Spain for a couple of months, the French experience in Iberia to see if we can draw some lessons on insurgencies and counterinsurgencies, and then Doug will take it from there. As far as the culture of the French army, and I know in the program it talks about the culture of the French army and how it was infected in the peninsula, it's very difficult. You'll hear me interchange French and imperial, and that's really the case. The French army in the peninsula, in the first couple of years of the war, 1807, 1808, 1809, was predominantly French. And then by the end of the conflict, it was more imperial, indicative of Napoleon's European empire, so that there were Germans, there were Italians, there were Dutch, there were Belgians, all serving in Iberia. And conversely, when he went into Russia, he actually had Portuguese and Spanish units serving in that army as well. Okay, so on to the Peninsula War. Well, Napoleon realized that his archenemy was Great Britain. And he also realized that he would have to come up with something different than conventional war to defeat the British. So he devised what was called the Continental System. And the Continental System was simply to close off all of the ports of Europe to British shipping, to destroy the British economy and undermine London's ability to provide generous subsidies to states like Russia and Austria and Prussia, who seem to be declaring war on France every so couple of years. So Napoleon's idea was destroy the British economy, and that will end wars on the continent. Well, believe it or not, by 1807, all of continental Europe was shut down except for Portugal. So Napoleon made the decision to send a small army to Portugal, and in the second half of 1807, that's exactly what happened. He did this in conjunction with the Spanish. Napoleon was not anti-monarchy by any means, but he was no friend of the Bourbon dynasty, which ruled Spain at the time. So he made an agreement with the Spanish, expecting the Spanish to fail in this agreement. And the agreement was that the Spanish would support the French invasion of Portugal, and in return, Portugal would be partitioned between Spain and France. Well, the French army reached Portugal, and behind the French army, thousands of French troops poured into Spain, supposedly on the mission being to support the French army that was operating in Portugal, because, as Napoleon predicted, the Spanish had failed to provide the support that they had agreed to. Well, as the Spanish countryside was being inundated with French troops, the Spanish people began looking around, wondering, why is this happening? What are all these French soldiers doing here? And as far as Portugal was concerned, the French took Lisbon, the Portuguese royal family sailed off with the British, they took the treasury and most of their government officials and sailed to Brazil. So Portugal did fall into French hands. And behind Portugal, French troops continued to move into Spain. So this was part of Napoleon's grand strategy. One of the myths you might say has come out of this is that Napoleon had no business going into Spain. Napoleon had no business going into Portugal. Well, he did have business because that was part of his grand strategy. He needed to close the continent, and to close the continent, he needed control of Portugal, and he could not have an unstable inefficient Bourbon monarchy between him and Portugal. As it was, the Bourbon monarchs of Spain recognized that, let's just say they saw the writing on the wall, and they proposed a marriage between the Crown Prince of Spain and one of Napoleon's sisters. Now, if there was a mistake made, this was probably where the mistake was made. Napoleon should have accepted the marriage, put his sister on the throne, and made Spain a puppet state. But he didn't. And instead, what he did was he forcefully, he arrested basically the King of Spain and his son, the Crown Prince. He invited them to Bayonne, Carlos II, and his son, Ferdinand, future Ferdinand VII, and he arrested them both and threw them into prison, and prison being a chateau in France, but nevertheless, they were locked up, and he made his older brother, Joseph, who was King of Naples at the time, he said, Joseph, you're getting a bump up, come on, out of Naples, you're now the King of Spain. Well, around the same time, the situation for French forces in Iberia had taken a turn for the not so good, so to speak. The British had landed an army in Portugal. The French corps that was in Lisbon marched out to meet it, and they were defeated. The Convention of Sintra was signed, and this was an agreement that was very embarrassing to London because it stipulated that the French army in Portugal would be shipped back to France with all of its arms and all its loot that it took out of the city. But regardless, the Spanish situation was such that now Napoleon had pretext to remove the Spaniards and remove the Bourbons and pump more troops into Spain with the failure of what became known as the first invasion of Portugal. So prior to officially removing the Bourbons and making his brother Joseph king, there were almost 200,000 troops in Spain. And this finally led to an uprising in Madrid, the Dos de Mayo. I know we celebrate the Cinco de Mayo in this country from the events in Mexico, but the Dos de Mayo uprising in Madrid sparked uprisings in other Spanish cities. And this came before the regime change, but interestingly enough, after the regime change, the insurgency really kind of fizzled out. 1808 was not a good year for the insurgency. The Spanish, other than some cities that held out for quite a while against the French, most famous being Saragossa, really the insurgency did not have much impact on what the French were trying to do in Spain in the year 1808. And this carried over into the end of the year when the French suffered a setback at the hands of Spain's conventional armies. On the 19th of July, 1808, the first Napoleonic army was not commanded by Napoleon himself, but it was still a Napoleonic army, was forced to surrender by conventional Spanish forces, and that was at Bailen in southwestern Spain. What immediately happened after that was the French basically collapsed. They withdrew out of Madrid. Conventional Spanish armies closed in on Madrid and secured the southwestern and central part of Spain. Well, of course, this was a huge embarrassment to Napoleon, and particularly the fact that his brother just, beat a retreat right out of Madrid without even trying to hold the ground of his new capital. So Napoleon, at the end of 1808, starts a massive buildup. Okay, so we're going to go. Tens of thousands of more troops are going to enter the country, but incidentally, what we see in the spring of 1809 is we had talked about the Arab Spring, the Prague Spring, and so forth. We had the Spaniard Spring in 1809. Okay, Napoleon went to Spain, and he took command personally, and he destroyed everything that was in his path. When he finished with the Spanish conventional armies, he turned on the British, who had come out of Lisbon and tried to invade or drive into Spain to attack the rear of Napoleon's army as it was crushing the Spanish. He turned on the British, drove the British all the way to the northwestern coast of Spain to Corunna, and the British barely were able to embark and escape. And this caused a huge backlash in London. It was an embarrassment. The soldiers who managed to escape at Corunna came home in really bad shape, and the British almost decided to wash their hands of getting involved on the continent. Fortunately for the Spanish and for the career of a gentleman named the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley, they did not take that drastic step. But here's where the situation breaks down. Napoleon believes that he has secured the peninsula, and he leaves and he goes back to Paris. After he leaves, he turns over part of the army to one of his marshals, Marshal Soult, and he tells Soult, go and secure Lisbon. The idea here is if we can secure Lisbon, if we can control Portugal, then the Spaniards have nothing to fight for. And the insurgency in Spain, which right now was really low intensity, will be done for good. Well, spring of 1809, the second invasion of Portugal begins, but as I said, London did not give up on the continent, and they sent a second British expeditionary force commanded by Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington. And in this stage, Wellington was able to defeat Marshal Soult, drive the French out of Portugal, and then pose direct threat to the rear of the French forces that were operating in Galicia to put down the insurrection there. Well, in this stage, the French laid out their objectives real clearly. They recognized, in this stage being the 1809 stage, they recognized very clearly that the insurgency was not a real threat, that the real threat were British and Spanish conventional forces. So what they did was they pulled back. They pulled back into central Spain and they regrouped. This regrouping really paid dividends in 1810. Okay? In 1810 we have basically what we would call, what we saw in Iraq with the surge. Okay? Napoleon by this time had fought another coalition war in Central Europe. He defeated the Austrians in what was called the War of the Fifth Coalition. So he started pumping more and more troops into Iberia. 360,000. Okay, like I said, we often hear about the numbers that went into Russia and who died in Russia, but by 1810 he has 360,000 operating in Spain. And with this huge amount of forces at their disposal, the French marshals were able to conduct a third invasion of Portugal and to conduct what we would call today counterinsurgent operations. Now, the surge in Iberia, the surge in Spain specifically, talk about numbers. The province of Navarre was a real key province because it was right astride the main line of communications running between France and the imperial armies operating in the Iberian interior. Well, the province of Navarre around April of 1809 had 2,500 French troops. The insurgency became so strong there that an actual insurgent army was formed, and they received generous support from the British, military training, British advisors, the whole 9 yards. And within less than a year, say around February of 1810, the French were able to put 20,000 men into the Navarre province. They wiped out the insurgent army and just about ended all insurgent activity in Navarre and actually started to draw down. So they were able to draw down considerably. Once violence re-erupted in Navarre, they moved their force levels back up to around 15,000, and they were able to secure the secure Navarre, at least, for that year. Well, what accounts for the ebb and flow of the success of the Spanish insurgents? Well, mainly it was the support, or at least the operation of conventional forces. The Spanish insurgency simply could not survive without British aid, either directly through material means, weapons, gunpowder, supplies, or through the operations of Wellington's army. And that's what we see with what happens in the 1810-1811 phase, Wellington wins some battles, particularly Talavera, where he picks up the title of the Duke of Wellington, but he retreats back into Portugal, and this leaves the insurgents without any conventional army working in Spain to distract the French. Well, time becomes the real essence here. If the French had had time to continue their counterinsurgent operations in Spain, it's very likely that the Spanish guerrillas would just be a footnote in history. But to gain that time, two important requisites were needed. The first was that Wellington's army remained quiet in Portugal. The second was that Napoleon left those 360,000 men in Spain, and neither's going to happen. And that's what's going to spell the doom for the French or imperial armies in Spain. What happens is, in 1812, the French are in very good shape. In fact, 1812, the early months of 1812 represent a high point as far as controlling the insurgency. In fact, the fall of Tarragona on the Mediterranean coast was a huge gain for the French, because Tarragona had been the port where mainly, I should say the main port where British supplies were coming in to feed the guerrillas that were fighting, particularly in Catalonia. Well, what's going to happen now is Napoleon's going to begin his drawdown for the invasion of 1812. He begins by taking 25,000 troops out. Then he denies his Spanish armies 50,000 replacements that were earmarked for them, and he uses them for Russia. Now, what's amazing is he drew them down to about 255,000 men from 360, and they were still strong enough. French forces in Iberia were still strong enough to maintain the insurgency and to keep Wellington bottled up in Portugal. However, in 1813, after Napoleon's disaster in Russia, he draws them down even more, and he pulls particularly crack units out of Spain. And as soon as those units leave, Wellington takes the offensive. And a lot of credit is due to Wellington, because even though, especially if you read English literature, English accounts, Wellington had no respect at all for the guerrillas. He hated working with the Spanish conventional forces, and he hated working with the guerrillas as well. Yet, he established excellent communication between his forces and the guerrillas, and this provided him with the information about how many troops were leaving Spain, what troops were leaving Spain, what areas were weaker than others, and using this information that he gleaned from the guerrillas, he was able to launch a final invasion in 1813, which broke the back of the French armies that were operating in Iberia. Well, this is really where the story of the counterinsurgency comes to an end, because once Wellington drives the French up against the Pyrenees, the guerrilla forces that were supporting him really become auxiliaries, because by now they're figure the first couple years of the insurgency, they were pretty much confined to the hill country, and then after 1811 they became bolder. They received more supplies from the British, so that by 1813 they're capable of fighting small French detachments in the open field. So Wellington uses them as auxiliaries to continue fighting the French in the open field. Well, to summarize and come up with some conclusions, first of all, the Spanish insurgency, the Great Guerrilla War, that if you read some accounts was, it's famously called Napoleon's bleeding ulcer. Well, that's incorrect. Okay, it wasn't Napoleon's bleeding ulcer. What Napoleon's bleeding ulcer was the conventional British army, the British who came back under Wellington. Wellington then was able to take the Portuguese army, which the British officer, Lord Beresford, had trained on the British model. So he had an Anglo-Portuguese army. The Portuguese were just as good as the British. And even though Wellington conducted a very lethargic military campaign in the peninsula, it was still enough to wear down the French armies, particularly in conjunction with the drawdowns that Napoleon had to do in 1812 and 1813 to replace the 500,000 men that he lost in Russia. So what was his bleeding ulcer? What was his bleeding ulcer was this British army that could not, this conventional British army that could not be defeated if the French marshals that were operating in Spain had been able to defeat Wellington, then the Spanish insurgency would have died out. In fact, without British support, it's doubtful the insurgency would have lasted past 1811 and certainly not past 1813. But as we've talked about in other sessions, you need time, and the French simply did not have the time. Some of the other myths that come out of Iberia is that, well, the guerrillas were important because they tied down lots of French troops. Not really. The French would have had to garrison and spread out throughout the country. They would have had to occupy large swaths of coastline to prevent the British from landing behind them. We saw that they did this in Germany in 1805, 1807, and then 1809, 1811. So it's very, very difficult to think that the French would have stayed concentrated around Madrid or somewhere, some other population center. That instead, it's much more likely that the French would have spread out their armies, and it's not because of the guerrillas where they had to occupy territory to suppress the insurrection. It's because that's what they would have had to do, basically, to sustain themselves. On that note, it's also been argued that, well, the insurgents won the War of the Harvests. They starved the French into submission in the peninsula. Once again, not really. The French doctrine of living off the land had basically died out in French armies, and by 1807, the French were supplying themselves traditionally with long supply wagons. You know, one of the great myths about the invasion of Russia is that Napoleon didn't feed his soldiers. Well, that's not true. He had tremendous supply depots set up all through Russia, but what happened during the retreat was that the soldiers who got there first ate everything and left nothing behind for the poor guys following up. So the guerrillas didn't defeat the Spanish insurgents didn't defeat the French logistically. And then there's the issue of morale. Well, it was brutal. The atrocities were terrible. The French experienced worse atrocities in Calabria. The Calabrians in Italy were extremely brutal, including cannibalism. There's one account where some captured French soldiers were barbecued, and the village priest passed out what we would call today hamburgers. So it wasn't the brutality of the guerrilla war that wore down the morale of the imperial soldiers serving in Iberia. And once again, this calls into question, who were these soldiers? Well, for the most part, the soldiers were from Central Europe. They were Germans, they were Italians, there were some Dutch units there, there were Belgian units there. So what sapped the morale of the French army in Iberia was, number one, being on the end of a long traditional supply or logistics system which stretched through the Pyrenees, and of course that was what was subject to threats from guerrillas. And number two, the news from Russia. The news from Russia rocked the empire, and several ethnic units serving in the Grande Armée question why they were there. Why were they continuing to serve Napoleon, particularly after some of their monarchs decided to join the Allies and fight Napoleon? So it's really hard to substantiate the contribution of the guerrillas to the French debacle in Iberia, particularly because if you take away Wellington's conventional army, if you take away the supply that the British provided, if you take away Napoleon's failed grand strategy of invading Russia, then I think what you have is a French victory over the insurgency. Listening to one of our earlier panels today, I was struck by how similar the insurgency in Spain was to the Vietnam War. Started out as an insurgency and really ended as a conventional war, particularly at the end when Wellington basically co-opted these Spanish guerrillas, small formations of Spanish guerrillas right into his army, and they conducted auxiliary operations. I don't want to go over, so I'll turn it over to Doug.
Okay. French army is not necessarily unique, of course. There's the Spanish army. The Spanish colonial army triggered this, the Spanish Civil War. I would certainly argue that colonial warfare had something to do with the Portuguese Revolution in 1974, and that many of the soldiers were politicized, actually fighting, especially in Guinea-Bissau. If you see the group of Portuguese soldiers that created that insurgency against Caetano and the Salazar-Caetano regime, most of them were politicized in those Portuguese colonial wars. The same thing happens in France. It's a fairly long process. It takes place over 150 years, roughly, but it points out some of the dangers, I think, of coin, in that the French army came to see coin very much as a separate category of warfare, and a separate category that gave them unique professional status within the French army, and allowed them, in their views, to set policy or to have a strong voice in setting policy in the colonies, to set policy in the interest of the army. And this actually, or at least how they defined the interests of the army, and this actually set them against the French government, so that under Charles de Gaulle, you literally had the government taking back authority from the French colonial soldiers. So how did we get there? I mean, what's the trajectory here? And obviously there's no immediate parallels, but I think there are certain sort of milestones in the evolution of French counterinsurgency that made it very difficult for them to corral the French army. The link here between Spain and the post-Napoleonic era is a man named Thomas Robert Bugeaud, who had been a colonel, 29-year-old colonel in Spain, and after the Napoleonic Wars, he was cashiered like most Napoleonic officers under the Bourbon Restoration. He went to the southwest of France where he was from. He had a small estate. He was a minor aristocrat, and he began to achieve a reputation as an agricultural specialist. A lot of agricultural experimentation in the years of the Bourbon monarchy, which of course ended in 1830. He was reincorporated in the French army in 1830, and he was also elected to Parliament. You could do that in France at the time. You could be a serving member of Parliament, and you could be in the military. General, there's hope for you yet. And this is a man not to be trifled with. People pick quarrels with him. I mean, if you had a debate with him in Parliament, he would challenge you to a duel and kill you. And he did that. He opened vacancies in several neighboring departments. So you wanted to be really careful if you got into a debate with this guy. The French had gone into Algeria in 1830. It was meant to be a punitive expedition. And the government fell. The Bourbon monarchy fell. The French were in Algeria, and no government was strong enough to decide what to do there. So the future of Algeria was in flux in the 1830s, and the French were not doing very well militarily there. In 1840, Bugeaud said, "I got the solution. I fought in Spain. I know how to deal with insurgents." So Bugeaud actively campaigned to be named Governor General and Commander-in-Chief in Algeria. He was so named in 1840. He went down, and just like in Spain, I mean, this was the Peninsula War without Wellington or Wellesley. In other words, the guerrillas wouldn't fight him. They were organized under a local Muslim leader named Abdelkader. And Abdelkader, of course, was running circles around the French during the usual insurgency campaigns. So Bugeaud said, okay, if he won't fight us, we'll make war against his base. So what you get is this horrible, horrendous war of atrocities against the population, Muslim population of Algeria, in which herds were slaughtered, villages were burned, women were raped. It was absolutely atrocious. The French got very upset with this, but it was very hard to control these guys. The French discovered that they really had no power to order Bugeaud out of Algeria. The army in Algeria had become a sort of power unto itself. So this was the first thing, that the army in the colonies had established a certain amount of independence. They had established a certain style of warfare which was extremely brutal, and yet the French couldn't control this, although it humiliated them and undermined the credibility of much of French policy. And then what happens in 1871? The French are defeated. They're defeated by the Prussians, and all of a sudden people say, see, I mean, you guys, not only are you brutal, but you can't fight. You can't fight a real army. I mean, the Prussians turn up and you lose. All right, so afterwards the French say, okay, we live next door to this unified Germany. We got a problem. We better form this really big conventional army that can do multi-arm operations organized into corps. None of this skirmishing with these Arabs anymore. We're going to fight real war. The thing is, the French still had these colonies. So eventually what happens is, in the post-1870 era, that you get this separation between those who do conventional war and those who do colonial war. So colonial war becomes a specialization within the French army. I mean, at first it's the Marines. The French Marines who do this, but the Marines aren't big enough. And so they start seconding army officers to the Marines, and then eventually in 1900, this separation is actually formalized into a separate colonial army. So you've got two armies in France. You've got the Metropolitan Army that has conscripts, prepares to fight a big war with Germany. Then you've got the colonial army that is all professional. It has a lot of indigenous recruits, and it does what they called at the time small wars. So these two groups don't really like each other. The conventional warriors say, this is not real war. You guys are out there dealing with ambushes. You're behaving in brutal ways toward the population. You're not real professionals. The colonial soldiers sort of reply with, no, colonial warfare has its own core of tactics and operations. Also, we have to govern. And what the French had set up was something called the Arab bureaus, which gradually transmogrify over time. So that if you're a colonial officer, then you're expected to do your stint in administration, that you're expected to run these tribal areas. I mean, the British had a similar thing in the Indian Political Service, which was also a militarized section of the army. So what you get in the colonies is what the British historian Hugh Strong calls civil-military fusion. And in other words, the military takes over civilian roles. And so there's really no distinction between government, the distinction we were talking about in the last panel, between police, law, military, government, all of these things. All right, so this is the sort of the divisions. The brutality is answered by the vocabulary that I sort of talked about last night. In the 1890s, both in Britain and France, you get this sort of anodyne vocabulary that's being developed to sort of mask what's actually going on. And this is where the term hearts and minds you start getting in Britain in the 1890s. You get the same thing in France, developed by Hubert Lyautey, this sort of equivalent of Colwell's Small Wars. Colwell's Small Wars is so you see, we really do have our own corpus, we really do have our own doctrine, we really are professional soldiers. Lyautey is developing these ideas of oil spots, or he's passing them on, Galliani and others are doing oil spots, peaceful pacification, show force so you don't have to use it. We're spreading French civilization. I mean, this is a vocabulary for the democratization of Europe. I mean, you're getting more political participation. You actually have to sell this to a population. And the other way they sell it is by saying, you understand that Germany is getting bigger and more powerful, and the French birth rate has stagnated. And we're going to, if we have to confront them in a conventional war, we're going to need all of these colored black soldiers to come and help us. So in World War I, this is what happens. In other words, you have over 1 million soldiers from the colonies serving in the French army. And I just came back from Bamako, Mali, and I was driving down the street in a taxi, and there was this huge monument to the Senegalese tirailleurs in the middle of the street. It was put up there in 1924, just to sort of celebrate. And of course, all black soldiers were called Senegalese, although they were not from Senegal necessarily. So the idea is that the colonies saved France in World War I. So this inflates the importance of the colonies, of colonial soldiering. So the colonial soldiers can say, you see, we have our own corpus, we came to save you. That, in other words, the greatness of France and the security of France is associated with overseas France, with this colonial warfare. All right, so this is what happens. Then you get World War II. French army collapses, and the colonial guys say, you know, you conventional guys, you know, you say you're so good, and look at this. I mean, you can't even defend the country. But we're going to continue to defend French interest in the colonies. What de Gaulle does then is to start picking off these colonies. And the conflict between the Gaullists and those French colonial soldiers who stayed loyal to Vichy becomes particularly bitter in Syria, Lebanon, and in North Africa. So the colonial army stayed loyal to Vichy. The Gaullists, of course, believe that power, French power, is concentrated on the colonies. So you've got these two different views of where French interests lie. Now, de Gaulle retires in '46, and what happened is then you get these French colonial officers moving back into Indochina, basically sabotaging on their own negotiations with Ho Chi Minh, which were going on in '46. Basically starting this Indochina war. I mean, they talked their way back in to get the British General Gracie to let them in. So the colonial war started in '46 basically by provocations of these colonial soldiers, who the French government, which is very weak, it's a multi-party system, cannot control, in part because they are supported by a coalition of deputies, which generally went under the name of Le Parti Colonial. It wasn't a real party, but it was basically people who shared this view that the colonies were important to French greatness. So it made it very difficult for them to control these officers. Now, these officers probably could have done okay had Mao not won the Chinese Civil War. I mean, they could probably have, they drove Ho Chi Minh up into the northern highlands, and they could probably control this okay, because Ho Chi Minh, and we talked about this today, yeah, he didn't have many weapons, he had no outside support. Once Mao decides to support him, then the French have a serious problem. And they keep trying these sort of colonial strategies. They present, and this is where the tension comes in. Dien Bien Phu was the product of two myths. One is the oil spot. It's often portrayed that Dien Bien Phu was the attempt to get a conventional battle by a conventional general, in this case Navarre, Henri Navarre. And he lost. In other words, once again, the conventional soldiers have come in and lost the war for us. In fact, what these bases aéroterrestres, they called, were supposed to do were supposed to be big oil spots to support the montagnards, who also grew opium, which the French depended on, especially special operations depended on for their money. So they were creating these bases aéroterrestres, and they decided to create one at Dien Bien Phu. That's the first myth is the montagnard and the oil spot. The second one is the French maquis. I mean, the necessary myth in France was that France had liberated itself, and it had liberated itself through the French resistance. So the idea that the French resistance had been extremely important, that special operations and OSS had been vital to liberating France. And Eisenhower sort of plays into this. He says, you know, the French resistance is worth 6 divisions. Whereas, in fact, we know now that about 1% of the French population maybe was in the French resistance, and most of them only did so because if they didn't join the resistance, they were going to be shipped to Germany for forced labor. So these were the two myths. So the loss of Dien Phu allowed the Fourth Republic to intervene and to say, okay, we're out of Indochina. But then, of course, as soon as that happens, Algeria flares up. A group of 9 guys who came together to form the FLN sort of start setting off bombs on the 1st of November, 1954. No basis of support. The idea is all these Muslim Algerians are going to rise up. Didn't happen. Nothing happened. So what happens, though, is that the French come back from from Indochina, and say, we've learned all these lessons. We know how to do real coin. So they start putting people in concentration camps, or resettlement, as they call it. They start all these sort of strong-arm, brutal tactics. They begin by experimental areas in 55 through 57. They move to what becomes the Battle of Algiers in 57. They take over the police functions. And basically, they don't trust any. They don't trust the Muslim population. And through their tactics, they actually create the base for the FLN that really had no base. So this is the situation. In 1958, the Fourth Republic says, okay, we're going to negotiate. We can't win this thing. We're not winning it. It's taking too much time. U.S. will not support us as they did in Indochina. So we're going to negotiate with the FLN. Well, basically, then the army said, okay, we're going to overthrow you. And they threatened to invade France. They started bombing in in Tunisia, which at that time was independent. So in essence, once again, the Fourth Republic could not control these guys. So only Charles de Gaulle could be brought in. So Charles de Gaulle comes in. Now here you've got the resurrection of 3 conflicts. The first one is the conventional colonial soldier conflict. Charles de Gaulle is a conventional soldier. He was at Verdun. He had fought the Germans. Europe is where France's interests lie, not Africa, not Indochina. We've got to focus on Europe, especially in the post-war era. So the whole argument that France is great because it has colonies, that does not wash with him. The idea that the colonial army is the main army, he's a conventional soldier, he doesn't believe in that. He's worried by this civil-military fusion, which has politicized these soldiers who are defying the government. So what he has to do is begin by dismantling all of these structures, the Psychium Bureau, the psychological action. He starts transferring these people, retiring them, and of course it gets this rebellion, which he has to put down. So that's the sort of trajectory. And then, I guess, and to sort of finish up, it worries me that then we're using this guy David Galula as one of the basis of our 324 manual. Now, if you look at Galula, he says, okay, here are 10 reasons why the French lost. Basically 10. I think, actually he lists 12 or 13, but a lot of them sort of overlap. Here are 10 reasons why we lost in Algeria. And in fact, if you look at what he says, the French did 9 of those things. In other words, it gets back to the point I think that Sebastian made. These are tactics, they're not strategy. In other words, you can have, the French used all the coin. They were very good coin guys. They knew how to do these tactics extremely well. But this didn't win it for them. In other words, it goes back to the point I tried to make last night, that the best tactics in the world will not save a failed strategy. And in essence, that's this sort of trajectory. And I think that we should maybe have some concern that that Galula is somehow seen as some sort of model for our coin strategy, or sorry, our coin tactics, coin manual.
Okay. Fortunately, there's been a lot of literature recently, kind of a renaissance in Peninsula War studies focusing on the guerrillas. And what we've learned from that is the guerrillas were primarily, how to put this in a nice way, they were bandits, basically. They were bandits. They weren't fighting for country. They weren't fighting to restore the Bourbon dynasty. They were fighting out of self-interest. They took advantage of the general collapse of authority. Some were no better than just bandits hiding out in hills, stealing from the French, terrorizing the Spanish population just as much as they did the French. Others were committed to driving the foreigners out. There was an economic base to it. There was an anti-French base to it. It's hard to say a nationalistic base, but more of a regional sense of defending your home province. And the size of these groups ranged from anywhere from 50 guys to 500 guys. And there were some famous leaders that came out of it. There was, as far as coordinated action among them, there was not a whole lot of coordinated action among them because it was very centralized on the province that they were operating in. The Galicians, the Catalonians, the Navarrese, the Andalusians. So it was not a nationwide or statewide effort. Now the Supreme Junta did support the various gangs, the various units of guerrillas, but there was not a whole lot of effort to coordinate their actions. The one who did the most to coordinate their actions was Wellington. When he ventured out of Portugal, and he, well, step back a moment, after the French launched their third invasion of Portugal, and this is the most famous one, the ones that broke on the lines of defense he built at Torres Vedras. After the French third invasion collapsed, then he came out of Portugal and ventured into Spain very cautiously. He was eventually, as I mentioned, driven back into Portugal, but that was very key. That's when he established the communication systems so that he can coordinate the operations with the guerrillas. So really you have a mixed bag for what the current literature is telling us, mainly the works of Charles Esdale, that it's really a mixed bag. There's some, it's mainly economic reasons, some just taking advantage of the general breakdown of authority, the collapse of authority, some resisting because they don't like French rule, others resisting. You've got the involvement of the church because of the fear that the French are going to attack the Catholic Church as they had done so during their own revolution. So it's really a mixed bag. And plus you have several soldiers from conventional armies leaving the Spanish army to go serve with the guerrillas because it was more lucrative. In fact, that was one of the concerns that the Spanish government in exile had to address, was as the guerrilla movements in various provinces enjoyed success, they attracted more manpower, and you have less recruits coming to Andalusia for the conventional army, because that's where the government in exile took up shop and tried to arrange. And this is one of the interesting components of this war. You've got French control of most of Spain, yet in Andalusia you've got a government in exile still functioning down at Cadiz, and it's still able to coordinate actual Spanish field armies. Now, their efficiency was not very good, and the French did not fear them very much, but the fact that they were still running around in western France was significant.
Okay, let me try to answer David. I think the brutality came from, and I'm not suggesting every French officer in every sector was brutal. I think it depended a lot on the unit. I think it depended on whether they were conscript, professional, and I think it depended on the degree of opposition or insurrection that they got. I think the brutality came from several directions. First was a lack of intelligence. I mean, several, and I think maybe you remarked on this, but although, and David French makes the point in the book that's coming out, he's let me see the page proofs, but basically he points out that these colonial societies were very fragile societies. And we were called, you know, he refers to them as fragile states that were very lightly administered, even though the British or the French or whatever the colonial power had been there for some years, and they may have developed a sort of civil service or a colonial service to deal with it. In many cases, they had to rely on indigenous peoples. So they didn't really know these societies, or they knew them superficially. There's a very interesting book. It's got its flaws. Patrick Porter, I don't know if you know that book, is called Military Orientalism.
Yes.
And it's a sort of criticism of these human train teams, the anthropologization of tactics and approaches, knowing the cultures of these enemies and how this really goes back. In fact, what happens is you get stereotypes. I mean, the idea of criminal tribes. This tribe doesn't cooperate with us, so their narrative must be wrong. So let's go in and change the narrative. So there's really a lack of understanding. And when you're an officer, or sorry, you're a soldier, and you're seeing these brown faces or black faces that you don't really understand, you don't speak their language. I mean, the idea is you're going to protect yourself. And you're going to use brutal methods to get intelligence. And again, French makes the point that where the British didn't have the intelligence, that's one reason they use resettlement tactics. They want to get everybody into these, you know, for want of a better word, concentration camps, which was the original meaning of concentration camp, was to concentrate the population. And there you got them, and you're going to sit on them until they tell you what you need to know. So lack of intelligence means that the tactics are very sort of indiscriminate. You've also got the racialization of strategy. And you know, this is a problem we had in Vietnam. I'm sure we must be having it in Iraq and Afghanistan. And where does this come from? It's not necessarily that we go out and the white soldiers are racist from the beginning. The argument is that they go out and they're attacked. And so they retaliate. And then they start identifying, you know, the attackers as all of that race. And so because of the operational doctrine is often very aggressive, it becomes very easy for the insurgent to provoke retaliation. In other words, all he's got to do is fire at a group of a patrol from a village, and the patrol will say, you know, village must be guilty, right? So it's collective punishment, collective fine, or we'll just destroy the village. And so I think, you know, I think this is inherent. I mean, we can say we like hearts and minds, and as long as everything's quiet, that's fine. But as soon as things turn bad, that many of these companies had no way of knowing who was at fault. So the retaliation was collective.
If I can add something to that, I think the French army is one of the most brutal when it comes to inflicting atrocities on civilian populations in Europe, going back to the 16th century. Their behavior in North America, their good behavior, was a concerted effort that the generals took, that the French commanders took to ensure. I think that was a real exception to the norm. Their violence was unrivaled in Europe. So I think there was, talk about culture, there was a culture of violence and what we would call today atrocity in the French army.
Yeah, and I'd add to that, this is really institutionalized in the colonies, because conscripts could not go to the colonies. And that means Indochina. That was not the case in Algeria, because Algeria, as it was pointed out, was considered part of metropolitan France. So conscripts could go to Algeria. But in the colonies, what they depended on was tribal levies and indigenous recruitment. And usually when you see these French expeditions in the 1890s, 1880s through really the Rif War, what they were often indigenous units with tribal levies. And what they would do is go to say, hey, Abdullah, we're going to go out and bash your tribe, this tribe next door who's your enemy. And oh, by the way, if you come along with us, we've got some rifles here left over from the Franco-Prussian War or whatever. And you can have anything you want. I mean, the Senegalese were famous for their so-called épouses libres, the so-called free wives. These were not free wives, these were sex slaves that had been captured in battle that used to follow these guys around, with their children and everything else. So this was institutionalized, and you see it. You see it in Italy in World War II, where you get a lot of atrocities from French North African soldiers. I mean, there's a scene in Two Women. It's a 50s film. There's a
Sophia Loren, where there's this rape scene where Sophie and her daughter are walking along and they're raped by North African soldiers. And North African soldiers had a terrible reputation in Italy. And that's, many of them were pulled when they invaded France in Anvil Dragoon in August '42, because they started behaving that way in France. And the French said, oh, well, you know, you can do that in North Africa, you can do it in Italy, but you can't do that in France. So they pulled a lot of these units. So you know, this was part of the incentive structure. And the officers sort of tolerated this.
Just a quick follow-up on that. Sorry, I don't want to hog the mic, but just a quick follow-up on that. So when you read David Galula and he says something like, oh, the soldier in counterinsurgency must not only be a soldier, but also a civilian, a social leader, and a community organizer, and economist, jurist, and I think a Boy Scout is in there as well. Do you feel like those words is just mere cant intended to fool, or is there something behind that in terms of France's practical experience with counterinsurgency? I mean, is he just lying his ass off?
Well, I mean, but
you
notice he also says that they have to prove to you that they're loyal. Don't trust any of them. I mean, he says that too. And he's writing really of the period 55 to 57. And he is in an experimental area where they're doing, you know, they're doing these things. They're bringing officers' wives with sewing machines. You know, they're doing all this, what we would call hearts and minds stuff. They're doing a lot of propaganda. And then they're also doing population concentration. And then when they generalize it, the whole thing sort of breaks down, because they're pulling people off the farms. They can't feed themselves. They sell their livestock, and then they starve to death. So, you know, I think what he's doing is giving you an ideal. But if you look what he says, I mean, you know, just look at how he describes his tactics. He said, what you do at market day, you go down the street, and you just pick up no less than 4 young men, no less than 4. You put them, if you read it, you put them in separate cells, and you interrogate them. Now, he doesn't say he beats them up, but he can certainly give them incentives to rat out, you know, the other guys in the other cells. Now, I'll let you go if you tell me who the FLN guys are in your town. And, you know, well, I got a date, you know, my buddy here, Abdullah, he's really an FLN. So, you know, you get to go. So there's all sort of incentives. The French generalized that, for instance, in the Battle of Algiers. And they're the best recruiters for the FLN, because they literally go down the street and start picking up these lycée students at the end of, you know, when the lycées let out. And these are people in the lycées, and they bring them in for interrogation. So all these guys say, no, I'm getting out of here. I'm not going to stick around because the French are going to pick me up. And I'm going to be in trouble. At the very least, I'm going to be tortured. And, you know, maybe disappeared. So, the French generalized these tactics, and my argument is created the support base for the FLN, which really had no support base, really had no strategy, beyond the very simple one that, you know, everybody hates the French and so they'll rise up. And I think there's we talk, I mean, I mentioned last night the sort of romanticism of counterinsurgency. There's also the romanticism of insurgency too. I mean, the Che Guevara, all they have to do is turn up and all the peasants will join us. I mean, this is what Brezhnev denounces this as a conspiracy of heroes. You know, my book, that's the title of one of the chapters. It's the conspiracy of heroes. It's the sort of competing romanticism of insurgency and counterinsurgency. And you've got Che and you've got Lawrence of Arabia. And these are the two sort of, you know, competing models.